Hi everyone, welcome to the holly tutorial. I've drawn a little holly leaf onto a piece of tracing paper. I'm going to turn that over and rub my graphite pencil over the back of it so that I can transfer it onto my watercolour paper. This is an ordinary HP graphite pencil. This is a piece of Saunders Waterford hot pressed watercolour paper. It's 27 centimetres by 37 centimetres, which is 10.5 inches by 14.5 inches. I've stretched the paper and I've attached it to my gator board. Now I want to trace on this little holly leaf so that I can do a practice leaf before I start. So I place the graphite side down onto the paper and then I use my pencil to trace over it. And there it is. So now what I have to do is take my eraser and rub over it to lighten the pencil line slightly. Once that paint goes on, I can no longer remove the pencil lines. So it's best to lighten them before you start painting. This is my Da Vinci Maestro number 5. It's a series 35. I like this brush because it's got a really fine point on it, and that's going to allow me to get right up into these little tight spots on the leaf. I'm going to start to wet the leaf with some water. I want to paint on wet paper. When I put the water on, I'll put it all over the leaf, but I won't take it right to the very edge of my pencil line. I'll leave about a brush stroke width of dry paper there. And that way, when I put the paint on, I'll put the paint all the way out to the edge, and it'll stop me from getting a darker line running around the outside edge of the leaf. Sometimes when you put water on the paper and you take the water all the way to the edge of your pencil line, when you put the paint on, sometimes the pigment will congregate around the edge of whatever it is you're painting and it'll leave a dark line. So this helps to stop it. I'll show you what it looks like. So you can see I've left the water away from the edge of my pencil line, just a brush stroke width. Okay, here's my palette. Right over here I've got some Winsor & Newton sap green, and this is the colour that I'm going to paint onto the leaf. I'll treat this leaf as a little practice leaf. So when I put the paint on, I take it all the way out to my pencil line. And then it hits the water that's on the paper, and then the water starts to move it. When you've got water on your paper and you've got water in your paint, you don't need a great deal of water in the brush. Sometimes what I'll do is I'll put the water on the paper, I'll pick up the paint, and then I'll tap the side of my brush on a cloth, and that will release a little bit of the excess water without releasing all the paint. I need a bit more paint. So I take it carefully around the edge of the leaf, and then in the middle of the leaf I can put it on fairly quickly. Keep reloading each time I need more paint, and if my brush gets too wet, I'll dab the side of it on a cloth. That has completely dried. Now what I want to do is wet the right hand side of the leaf. So I run the water down the centre vein, and then I'll take it out towards the edge of the leaf, but again I'll leave a little gap, little brush width gap around the outside edge, so I won't take the water all the way out. So when I paint the water on, I paint that on as carefully as I paint the paint on. I want it to be covered evenly. I don't want there to be puddles lying anywhere. Still using sap green, but this time I want a bit more pigment. So I wipe my brush over the paint and I mix it into this little puddle that I've got on the palette. And this time I'm going to paint just on the right hand side of the leaf. So I run it down the centre vein and out towards the edge. You can see it's darker this time, there's more pigment in there. I take the paint all the way to the edge of the leaf, and again I do this carefully. The water gives me a bit more time in the sense that I won't get any hard paint edges forming as the paint dries. It gives me a bit more time to get the paint on there. That's completely dry now. So what I want to do is paint this other side, but I want to leave a little line of light colour showing down the centre that will form the centre vein. So if I draw a line down the centre, I'll know not to put any water or paint past that line. And that will form the centre vein then. So I'll wet this side. I'll do exactly the same thing on this side that I did on the other side, except I leave that little strip of light paper showing down the middle. And make sure the other side is dry, otherwise you risk smudging it with your hand if it's not. And again, I don't take the water all the way out to the edge. So that's completely covered now. And there it is there. You can see I've left that little strip down the centre dry, and I haven't taken it all the way to the edge of my leaf. So again, I wipe my brush over the paint to make it a bit darker. And then I paint that on. This is where I have to be careful that I keep the paint off that centre vein. And I keep going. That's completely dry now. So what I've got down the centre is my vein here, but sometimes that can look a bit stiff and hard. So what I can do is take some clean water and gently paint that over the top of the entire leaf. That will dissolve a little bit of pigment and it'll redistribute it over the top of the vein. That will make the vein slightly darker and it will push it back down into the leaf. It'll also soften the hard edges that surround the vein. What I have to do is make sure I do this very gently. So I'm not putting very much pressure on my brush. I'm also taking the water right to the edge of the leaf this time. Because if I don't, I will get a secondary waterline forming where I stop my brush. You can see I've got a little bit of pigment on my brush, even though I didn't pick any pigment up from my palette. That's just the pigment that's coming off the leaf. So that's pushed that little vein back down into the leaf. It doesn't look so pronounced now, and it's softened the paint edges slightly. So here I'm just carefully taking it right to the edge so I don't get a waterline. I allowed that to dry Now I'm re-wetting this right hand side. What I want to do is darken some areas of it, not the whole lot of it, just little sections of it. So I'll just concentrate on the right hand side first. Now I want some really dark pigment on my brush. So I'm going to wipe the wet brush over the paint that's on the palette. I give it a little twirl to get my point back. You can see that pigment now. So you can actually see the green on the brush. So now I dab that onto the wet paper to darken a section of it. It doesn't matter where you do it. I've just chosen this little pointy out bit here, and I'll take it down the bottom here. I don't have a reference photo. I'm just doing my own thing with this. If I was following a reference photo, I would look at the photo and see where I can see some darker areas, and that's where I'd put it on. So now I'm going to wash the paint out of my brush, dab it on a cloth, and I'll use my clean brush. So there's nothing on it now. I'll use my clean brush to soften the paint edge further. I just spread it out a bit. So that gives me that darker edge and it makes the leaf look a bit more interesting. Now I can do the same thing on this other side. So I wet it with water on this other side. Might be a good idea to wait until the other side is dry so you don't disturb it. I won't show you all the wetting again. So then with my wet brush, I pick up the pigment by wiping my brush over it. I can squish it into my palette to make sure it's evenly distributed through the bristles. And then I paint that onto the wet paper. Now again, as I said, if I was following a reference photo, I would put this darker colour where I see it's darker on the reference photo. But because I don't have one, I'm just putting it wherever I feel like putting it. So now I take the paint out of my brush. I dab my brush on a cloth or a towel to take the excess water off it. And then I can use it just to gently spread that paint out a little bit. Sometimes I don't do that. Sometimes I just leave it as it was. But sometimes I like to fiddle with it. Okay, I've done my little practice leaf. Now I want to draw an arrangement of holly leaves. I think I'll do 3 of them and I'll put some little berries with them. So I trace my leaf on. Okay, then I move the paper and I'll put another one on where I think I want it. Probably about there. I think that looks okay. I trace that on. When I trace, I don't press too heavily because if I do, I'll dent the watercolour paper underneath. So I try to press just hard enough to release the graphite without making a dent on the watercolour paper. Then when I've got that one where I want it, I'll put this third one on, and I'm thinking I might overlap this one slightly with that first leaf. So it'll sit slightly underneath it. This is why I drew the leaf on the tracing paper so that I could see the other leaves when I did this. And there it is. I've got a few grubby marks there where I pressed against it with my fingers, but my eraser will take that off fairly easily. I need to make sure that my pencil lines aren't too dark on the leaves themselves, so I'll lighten those slightly. And I'll draw in some berries over the top. I think I'll do 3. I'll start with this leaf up here. So I wet all of it with water the same way I did that little practice leaf. But I make sure that I leave a little brush width gap around the outside edge. Once it's covered with water, I start to paint a layer of sap green over the top. Not too dark just yet. I just want to show you, if you put the paint on too dark, like that, just wash the paint out of your brush and spread it around. Sometimes you might pick up more paint than you anticipated. Don't panic. You've got water on the paper, so you've got time. Just wash the paint out of your brush and then move it around. So that's all covered in a layer of sap green. It's not too dark just yet. I will go darker with the next layer. I've just painted that other one in the same way, and now I'm doing this one. So I wet it with water first. I didn't take the water all the way to the edge. Now I've got the sap green that I'm painting on carefully. Okay, so that's that one all painted in. So that needs to dry completely now. I'll start with this one. I'll wet the right hand side of it. Then on goes some sap green, but it's a bit darker this time. I run it down the centre vein and take it all the way out to the edge of the leaf. I'll leave that to dry and I'll come over here onto this one and do the same thing. So I wet it with water first and then the sap green again. I've done one side of each of the leaves and all three of them have completely dried. Now I'm drawing in that centre vein. Now I can start the other side. I do exactly the same thing. I wet it with water. I don't take it all the way to the edge of the leaf, but I also don't take it over the top of the little centre vein. And then on goes the paint. And I'll do all three the same way. So that's all three of them done. So now what I want to do is wet over the top of them, which, as I said, softens that centre vein down, puts a little bit of pigment over the top of it. You need to make sure your leaves are completely dry before you do this. I always get my hairdryer out and give it a good blast with the hairdryer to make sure. And then when I put the water on, I do it very gently. I use a soft brush. My brush is very soft and hardly any pressure. Okay, they've been done and they're dry now. Now I can get some colour onto the berries. This colour here I've got on my palette is called Scarlet Lake by Winsor & Newton. It's a semi-transparent red that I often use. This I'm going to paint on dry paper and I'll paint all three berries in at once. What I need to be careful of is that I don't get any paint on the leaves. So I just have to be careful and paint slowly. And when I've got them washed in, I need to let them dry. Okay, they are completely dry now. So now I'm going to work on this one at the bottom. So I'm going to wet it with water. Just that berry, not the other ones. All over it with some water. I will take it right to the edge this time. It's only a little tiny berry, so it won't matter so much. This colour here is Windsor Violet. I'm going to paint that onto the wet berry where it touches the other two berries, and that will create a little shadow there. Put a little bit on this other side as well. If I was following a reference photo, I would look at the reference photo and try and find the darkest areas, and that's where I'd put this. That would be the areas that are away from the light. If the paint spreads too far, take the paint out of your brush and use your damp brush just to push it back where you want it. Sometimes the water might take it too far, so take a little bit of paint off if it does that. I waited for that berry to dry, and now I'll paint this one. You can dry them with a hairdryer if you don't want to wait for it to dry. I often have a hairdryer plugged in next to me when I'm painting. So that's wet. Now I've got Windsor Violet again. I run it around the outside edge, and because there's water on the paper, it bleeds back over the berry. It helps to make the berry look rounder. That one dried, and now I'm wetting this one with water. I'm using Windsor Violet again. I'm going to come back and put a little bit more colour there. That's Windsor Violet. Everything has dried. Now I'm wetting this one again that I started with. What I'm going to do now is paint another layer of the Scarlet Lake over the top to brighten it up. So Scarlet Lake, I want it fairly dark. I give my brush a little twirl to get the point back. And then I paint that onto the wet paper. Now I'll probably lose a little bit of violet, but I will come back and put a bit more of it on later. Now this time I'm not going to take the pigment all the way over the top. What I want to do is leave a little section of the lighter colour showing through. So you can see I've just taken that around the outside edge, and I've left a little lighter spot in the middle. Now I'll take the paint out of my brush and use my damp brush to soften that edge further. So I'm just pushing the paint away from it a little bit. And that little lighter section there creates a highlight on the berry. Now I'm getting a little bit more violet, and I'll dab that on to the damp red paint just to increase that shadow in there. Now I'll wet this one. That other one that I just painted is dry, and I'm going to do the same thing. So Scarlet Lake again, and again I'm going to leave a little lighter section that I won't put any paint on. Now I'll take the paint out of my brush and I'll dab it on a cloth, and I use it to soften the edge of the highlight. Then I'll get some Windsor Violet again, and I'll deepen the shadow again while that red's still damp. If the red had started to dry, I would need to dry it completely and then re-wet it with water before I put the violet on there. Now I wet this one with water. The other two are dry. I don't want to disturb them. Scarlet Lake again. And again, I'll leave a little section that I won't cover with paint, which will give me a little light spot. This one I'm not going to worry softening around the edges of the highlight. I'll just put the purple straight on there. So that's Windsor Violet. I don't need very much of it on this one, just where it touches the other berries. Now I've got some Windsor Violet on my brush again, and I'm painting in those little spots in the centre. That's on dry paper, although that one just there was on damp paper. They're dry. I just want to outline around the edge of where I just painted. So that's Windsor Violet as well. Now I want to paint on the darker areas on the leaves like I did on the practice leaf. So I'll wet one side of this one with water. Okay, so now what I want to do is get some sap green on my brush, fairly dark. So I'll wipe it over the pigment. I'll give it a little squish on the palette to push it into the bristles. And I'll twirl my brush to get my point back. And I paint that onto the wet paper. I'm going to put it down near the berries to make a little shadow down there. Run it up the side of the vein. If you've got any untidy edges, this is a good chance for you to try and tidy them up with this darker paint. Now I'll take the paint out of my brush, dab it on a cloth. It's just damp, and I can use it to blend edges. Sometimes I don't need to do that, like I said. I'll do this other side as well. I'm not waiting for it to dry, but if you're worried about disturbing it, wait till it dries. I'm just going to be careful and make sure I don't touch that other side. I've got the vein up the middle that I can leave dry. So all over the other side with water. This paint here is pretty dark, so I'll use that. And that goes onto the wet paper. I'm not taking it over the vein. I think I'll leave that dry. And as I said, this gives me the chance to tidy up any edges that I don't like. I'm going to get a bit more paint. Just want to darken it just a little bit more here, so I can dab that on and make it a bit darker there. Now I'll take the paint out of my brush and then soften the edge a bit more. This one here is underneath that one, so I'm thinking I should put a shadow on this one where the two leaves touch. So I'll wet that area with water, and then I'll paint some of that darker sap green just there. I'll wet it all so that I don't get any water lines forming. So that's all wet all over. And this is sap green. It's fairly dark, there's lots of pigment there. I think I'll get a bit more paint. I can see a funny edge here where I don't like the way the paint's dried, so I'll cover it over with some darker paint. Then I take the paint out of my brush and I can use it just to smooth that away a bit. Now to balance the leaf out, I think I'll put a bit of darker colour up here as well. So I've got to re-wet it with water because it was starting to dry. And this is sap green again. So I've wiped my brush over the pigment. take the paint out of my brush, blend it gently. That gives me the darker edge there on the front. Now I'll wet this one. So that's wet all over it. Now I'll get some sap green again. And I'll paint this down near the berries. I've actually painted that colour over the vein a bit there as well. Now I've got a damp brush, I can smooth that edge away. And I've just put a bit of that green up here as well. And then I soften the paint edge with my damp brush. So I could leave it like that, or I could go darker still. So I'm going to use a bit of Windsor Violet down here now. So I've just wet that with water. And now I've got Windsor Violet. I'm doing the same thing. So I put that darker colour where I want it. And I'll take the paint out of my brush and I'll blend away the edge some more. So now I've got nothing on my brush. Spread it out a bit, soften the edge. Make sure there's no water line forming. I didn't take the water all over this one. So water on this one. And some Windsor Violet. So I put it where I want it roughly. And then I remove the paint from my brush. Make sure my brush isn't too wet. And I use it to smooth the paint edge out. And I've just done the same thing on this one. That's with the Windsor Violet. And I've put a bit up the top too. I'm running it down the vein and then I'll put it on this top right edge. Take the paint out of my brush. Make sure there's no water lines forming. And I've done it on here as well. I've wet it with water first. And that's Windsor Violet. I only wet the right hand side, I didn't wet the other side. That's why it's sitting nice and neatly against the edge of the vein. I don't like the way the paint has dried right up on the tip of this one. The paper's completely dry now. So I've got a wet brush, it's just water on my brush, and I'm painting that over the top, which will dissolve that pigment slightly and allow me to tidy up that area. So there's no paint on my brush at the moment, it's just water. So that looks better. Everything's dry. I'm just going to come in and tidy up the edge of some of the berries with my pencil. Sometimes they get a bit misshapen. So practice those leaves and berries as many times as you need to. It's not easy. I probably make it look easy. It's not. So just keep practicing and paint them over and over until you get a leaf that you're happy with. And then paint a few more. So thanks everybody. I hope you enjoyed the tutorial.